Future leaders of the human rights movement, the future leaders of virtually all the important aspects that make the world a better place. And I'm here tonight and want to mention one of the people who most inspired me in my own life. I'll never forget when I was a 14 or 15-year-old young man. I have to admit I was a terrible, terrible student in Yeshiva High School, to the point where my principal, Rabbi Zurov, who is still alive, came over to me and said to me, Avi, that was my name until I got to college. My parents decided I need a real name when I got into college. I was Avi. My principal said, Avi, you know, you got a good mouth on you, but you're not so smart. And you have to figure out something to do with your life that you use your mouth a lot, but not your brains. He said, I have two suggestions. One, you could be a lawyer, or two, you could be a conservative rabbi. This was an Orthodox rabbi who couldn't even pronounce the word reform. And I went through high school thinking I was not particularly bright. And then I went to camp when I was about 15 or 16 years old. And I was privileged to have, as one of the counselors in the camp, a young man who lived in my neighborhood in Borough Park, tall, 6'2" or 3", very, very brilliant. And one day he came over to me and said, you know, Avi, I hear things about you that people say you're not smart. He said, don't let anybody ever tell you that you're smart. You're very smart. And that man's name was Yitz Greenberg, and he's here today. And everything I am in the world, I owe to you, Yitz. And I want to explain and describe. And of course, Yitz, please get up and take a bow. You really deserve it. One of the greatest treasures of my life is later on in life, we became mishpacha, we became related. Now he's not only my mentor, my rabbi, my teacher, my historian, but he's also my relative. And so I'm so pleased to have him here today. You know, I've always had a dream. I've wanted to be young enough to go on Birthright, but that's never gonna happen. So this is as close as I'm gonna get, and I'm gonna take complete advantage. I'm gonna practically pretend I'm one of you, make believe that I'm a young person again, and enjoy our conversation. I wanna start out with just a few basic words about Israel. Okay, a challenge. Name any country in the history of the world that has accomplished as much in 62 years as Israel has since its rebirth in 1948. There's going to be a silent response because it has never happened in the history of the world. When I read the other day that Norway was complaining that maybe Israel shouldn't be admitted to some great economic group that includes Greece and Ireland and other third world economies, it occurred to me, Norway? Israel has accomplished more in 62 years than Norway has accomplished in 1,000 years. Israel has accomplished more in 62 years than France has accomplished in the last 62 years after hundreds of years of existence, than Great Britain. Israel has exported more life-saving technology per capita than any country on the face of the earth. And in absolute terms, this tiny new nation is second behind the United States, ahead of England, France, Germany, Japan, and every other country in the world. Israel has done more with things like Better Place to have environmental concerns. Within 10 years, Israel's going to probably have a complete fleet of electric cars and a complete system of electric gridways for cars. It has done more by developing drip agricultural technology to save water. The high tech today would be unimaginable without Israel's input. It is the most remarkable 62 years that any country has ever had. Amazing, remarkable. When you think of Israel's great research universities, particularly Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University, the Technion, but the others as well, Ben Gurion and Bar Ilan, the numbers of published articles that have received high acclaim, the number of Nobel Prizes, the number of publishing citations have exceeded those of the great universities of Europe that have been in existence for 500 and 600 years. Today, the major universities of Israel are the absolute equal of European universities. And all this was accomplished in the middle of so many wars and so many threats to Israel's existence. You imagine what the peace dividend would be like if Israel could literally turn its swords into plowshares. if literally we saw real shalom instead of shalom, shalom, ve'en shalom, peace, peace, but there is no peace, which is what Israel has experienced since its rebirth in 1948. It's absolutely remarkable. And yet, notwithstanding the fact that the world should be praising Israel, the world should be thanking Israel, the world should be astounded by Israel's accomplishment, instead, the world, and much of it, is on a campaign to try to delegitimate the Jewish state, to try to say it has no right to exist as a Jewish state. After all, there are how many, 40 or 50 Muslim states, how many Christian states, but room for one Jewish state? No, that's racist. That's apartheid, to have a Jewish state, not to have, people forget that the Palestinian Authority's first two laws were, one, Palestinian state will always be a Muslim state, a Muslim state in which priority for Muslims, Muslim law, Sharia law, etc. The second law is the law of return. Palestinian Authority passes those two laws. Wow, that's progressive. Israel has those two laws following the Holocaust, and it's called racist. The demonization, the delegitimation. It starts with history. It starts with Holocaust denial. I'm not talking about Holocaust denial of the kind we see from the crass deniers that come to your campuses every so often and try to peddle their nonsense. There's an Israeli Jew named Gilad Atzmon, who was one of the leading jazz musicians in all of England. He's a saxophonist, very popular. He has a website, he's written illustrated novels, he's very, very popular. And he denies that the Holocaust occurred. He recently made an apology. He said he apologized because he had compared the Israeli military to the Nazi military and the Gestapo. And he apologized to the Gestapo and the Nazi military for making that comparison, because he said that Israel was so much worse. So my second question. Name any country in the history of the world, any country, faced with comparable threats. Threats of rockets from the Gaza. Threats from much more dangerous rockets from Lebanon. Threats from Iran trying to go nuclear. Threats of terrorism. Name a country faced with comparable threats that has ever had a higher standard of human rights, a higher standard of civil liberties, a higher standard of concern for civilians, and better rules of engagement during wartime. You can't do it. It's impossible. No country in the history of the world faced with comparable threats has ever had a better record. I'll give you one example. When Eliezer Shkedi became the head of the Air Force, Israel was using targeted killings of terrorists, much like the United States is now doing, and England is now doing, and NATO is now doing in Afghanistan and in Iraq. You find the terrorist, hopefully we'll find Osama bin Laden one day, and usually it's impossible to arrest them, so they're targeted, and with any luck, they're taken out of commission. So Israel was doing that, not on the West Bank, because they can make arrests on the West Bank, but in the Gaza. And the ratio, before General Shkedi got to office, the ratio was 1-to-1. For every terrorist killed, a civilian was killed, which is the best ratio that any army had ever achieved, 1-to-1. To give you a comparison, on 60 Minutes not so long ago, the United States Army spokesman said the ratio in the United States is if we can kill a terrorist by merely killing 30 civilians, we regard that as appropriate. And if you want to kill more than 30 civilians, you have to get the permission of the President of the United States. In Israel, the ratio was 1-to-1. Shkedi said that wasn't good enough. And he changed the munitions, and he changed the rule of engagements, and by the time he left office, the ratio was 29 terrorists killed for one civilian. One civilian for every 29 terrorists. Something that everybody thought was an impossible ratio to achieve. By the way, this is not my statistic. This is a statistic that comes from Haaretz, which is not Israel's greatest defender or closest friend. So it's absolutely true. And yet I know all of you on your college campuses have heard that Israel is the worst human rights violator, that it's terrible in terms of civilians, and you've seen all the demonstrations in Israel, Apartheid Week. So part of the delegitimation is historical. And by the way, when you try to correct the historical record, and when you say to those who oppose Israel and say there ought to be only one state and it ought to be Palestine, and they're on the right side, they're on the liberal side, and you're on the conservative side. When you point out to them that the founder of Palestinian nationalism back in the 1920s and up through the 1950s was a man named Hajj al-Husseini, who was a self-avowed Nazi who went to Germany and spent the war years with Hitler, went to Auschwitz with Eichmann, learned how to make gas chambers, and was going to come to Nablus and create a gas chamber to exterminate the Jews of the Middle East if the Germans had won the war. When you tell them that, and when you tell them that pictures of Hajj al-Husseini were on the homes of so many Palestinians during the Second World War, they simply don't hear it.